Hey guys, welcome back to Tech Guides TV. Today we're looking at LeetCode 286, Walls and Gates. It's a LeetCode Premium question and medium level difficulty. I highly recommend checking out LeetCode Premium. It's definitely worth it. You're given an m times n grid rooms initialized with these three possible values: -1, 0, or INF. So -1 is going to represent a wall or an obstacle. 0 is going to represent a gate, and INF is shorthand for infinity. It means an empty room. We use the value 2 to the 31st minus 1 equals 2147483647 to represent infinity, as you may assume that the distance to a gate is less than that. All right, so that's how we're going to represent the m by n grid. And the question asks us to fill each empty room with the distance to its nearest gate. If it's possible to reach a gate, it should, if it's impossible to reach a gate, it should be filled with INF. And there's an example 1 of the expected output and an example 2, another one. Let's attempt this solution in TypeScript. Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're looking at LeetCode 286, and here's the code. Right, we write a function called walls and gates. It takes in a numbers array, an array of arrays, it looks like. Yeah, that's an array of arrays. Return type void. Okay, so we have four constants: infinity, rows, columns, directions. Five constants. Q is the m by n grid, representing the squares of the, the floor plan essentially. You have a for loop with an inner for loop with an inner if statement, followed by a while loop with an inner for loop and another if statement. Let's dive deeper and take a look at the code. So it looks like if rooms at I and j is triple equals to 0, q dot push I comma j. All right, so we're pushing these values I and j into the q array, right? Which is it's an array of arrays. It's a grid, right? It's a m by n grid. That's how you represent it. Okay. And then the while loop does what? Q dot length, if it's greater than 0, set a constant row comma column equals Q dot shift. And now is a good time to go over the shift method. And I'm assuming you guys already know the push method, right? We push a value onto the end of the array. Now we're going to look at shift method. So here's an example of the array shift method. What it does is it shifts the first indexed value over by popping out essentially the 0th index element. So it shifts over once. So I wanted to make sure you guys saw the shift function. It's a built-in array function that you can use. I'm sure you're familiar with like push and pop, but it's a good idea to also review shift and unshift. And we return that 0th element. The array size decreases by 1 when you use shift. So if we console.log array1 after the shift, it returns 2 comma 3. If we console.log first element, it returns the first element essentially that was taken out of the array. You guys see that? Cool. So, and you'll see that we use that in the code on line 18, q.shift. So that's sort of what the shift method does. All right, so now with that out of the way, I want to get your attention on line 24. All right, and don't be intimidated, but this is kind of like the scariest line of code I've seen in a while. But really, what this boils down to, you guys know in the parentheses after an if statement, if it evaluates to true, if that whole thing evaluates to true, then the code runs. All right, but it's such a complex, sort of multifaceted, you know, um, expression, right? That it's gonna take like a minute and a half to sort of wrap your head around. So new row has to be greater than or equal to zero, and new row has to be less than rows, and new call has to be greater than or equal to zero, and new call has to be less than calls, and rooms with index new row, new call has to triple equals infinity. So if all of those things evaluate to true, then that code is run. Lines 25 and lines 26 are run. If even one bit of that makes, you know, ends up false, then the whole thing becomes false because we're not using ors, we're using ands, right? So that has to be true, and that has to be true, and that third part has to be true, and the fourth part, right? There's so much to it. But if you see something crazy like that, it's just I don't know, whoever wrote the question is just kind of testing your resolve at that point, but just break it down into simple Boolean, true or false, true or false, true or false. If it's true, true, false, the whole thing's false. If it's true, false, true, the whole thing's false. If it's asking for, all five parts of this to be true, then if they're all true, then you run the code. And you might often see like an else if chained after, your initial if statement and another else if, and then an else to finish the conditional code block. So that's what makes this sort of a medium level question. But it's not impossible, but it is difficult. All right, guys. So if all of that evaluates to true, then rooms at new row, new call equals rooms at row call plus one, q dot push, new row, comma, new call. All right, guys. So there's a code. Let's see. What else should we let's take a look at line 9 next. So we know Q is a grid of numbers, right? So on line 9, we're doing a loop to go through the rows, and then the inner loop handles the columns. Okay? We traverse through the grid of numbers. If rooms at I, j, triple equals 0, Q dot push I comma j. All right, so this is how we're filling up the queue grid that we declared in line 7. We're filling it up with the values passed into the walls and gates function. Hopefully that makes sense. Um, so that the the values in the empty queue, the empty grid, so to speak, are updated with the values from our um, rooms grid. Okay. Now let's look at the second code block from line 17 onward. If q dot length is greater than 0, we run this code. We set const row comma column equal to q dot shift. Remember the shift function gets us that first element. And then for const dx comma dy of directions, what is directions? We simply have to look up to line 5. It is -1 comma 0, 1 comma 0, 0 comma -1, and 0 comma 1. So if dx comma dy of directions, um, for const dx comma dy of directions, const new row equals row plus dx, const new call equals call.dy. All right, so far so good. Now, that crazy bit of code in line 24, right? If that value is to true, if all that is is good, right? That's sort of how that's the logic for determining the distance to the nearest gate. Remember, 0 means it is a gate. Okay, -1 means it's a wall. But all the empty squares have a certain number of squares away from the next closest um, gate. And that's what the expected grid shows the values of 0, meaning it is a gate, -1, meaning it's a wall, or a positive integer, meaning the distance to the closest gate. If it's not 0, if it's not a gate, it's going to be either 1 square away, 2 squares away, 3 squares away, or something like that. So that's the output grid. And we'll see in case 1, the expected output is what we get. And in case 2, the expected output is what we get. All right, guys, hopefully that was helpful. Tune in again tomorrow for another one.